A single word whispered by a child who had never spoken changed everything for Marcus Holloway, a tech titan whose fortune could buy silence but couldn't erase the past. The boy was 7 years old, diagnosed with severe nonverbal autism, and had spent his entire life in silence. But when Elena Vasquez, a quiet housemaid with calloused hands and tired eyes, knelt down to pick up his fallen toy, the child looked directly at her and spoke his very first word. It wasn't mama or dada. It was a name that made the billionaire's blood run cold, a name that unlocked a door he'd sealed shut 15 years ago. Why would this one word from an innocent child unravel the carefully constructed empire of one of the world's most powerful men? The answer lies in a story of desperate choices, buried guilt, and a truth that was about to surface in the most unexpected way possible. The Holloway estate sat like a modernist sculpture against the evergreen forests of Mercer Island, Washington, 42 acres of manicured perfection where even the trees seemed to stand at attention. The main house, a masterpiece of glass, steel, and Northwest cedar, had been featured in Architectural Digest twice. Its clean lines and soaring windows spoke of a man who valued control, precision, and the illusion of transparency while revealing nothing of substance. Marcus Holloway had built this fortress, just as he'd built everything else in his life, from the ground up with calculated determination and an almost pathological attention to detail. At 42, he was the founder and CEO of Vertex Technologies, a cloud infrastructure company that powered nearly 40% of the world's internet traffic. His net worth fluctuated between 8 and 10 billion depending on the stock market's mood, but Marcus himself never fluctuated. He was constant, controlled, coldly brilliant. The tech press called him the algorithm, a man who seemed to run on pure logic, who made decisions with mathematical precision, who never showed emotion in negotiations or interviews. His slate-gray eyes, sharp jawline, and prematurely silver-touched hair made him look like he'd been carved from granite. He wore custom-tailored Italian suits in blacks and grays, drove a Tesla he'd personally helped engineer, and kept his personal life so private that even his closest business associates knew almost nothing about his family. But every fortress has a weakness, and Marcus Holloway's was currently sitting on the floor of the great room, arranging wooden blocks in geometric patterns only he could understand. Julian Holloway was 7 years old, almost 8, and he'd never spoken a single word in his entire life. The boy was beautiful in the way autumn leaves are beautiful, vibrant, unreachable, existing in his own separate world. He had inherited his mother's rich chestnut curls and olive complexion, combined with his father's sharp, elegant bone structure. But his dark brown eyes, fringed with impossibly long lashes, rarely met anyone else's gaze. He was diagnosed with severe autism spectrum disorder at 26 months old, and the diagnosis had arrived like a tsunami, washing away the future Marcus had planned and replacing it with something he couldn't code, couldn't solve, couldn't control. Marcus had responded the only way he knew how, by throwing money at the problem. The estate had a fully equipped sensory therapy room that cost more than most people's houses. Julian had a rotating team of specialists, speech therapists, occupational therapists, behavioral therapists, a developmental pediatrician who flew in from Boston once a month. Marcus had funded research grants at 3 universities studying autism and communication. He'd personally interviewed every single person who worked with his son, running background checks that would make the FBI jealous. Nothing worked. Julian remained locked in his silence, communicating through gestures, sometimes through high-pitched sounds of distress, often through simply withdrawing into himself. He had his routines, blocks arranged in specific patterns, the same breakfast at the same time every day, the same route through the house for his morning walk. Deviations from routine could trigger meltdowns that lasted hours. Marcus had learned to read his son's needs through pattern recognition, the same way he read market data. A certain tilt of the head meant hunger. Hands over ears meant sensory overload. Rocking meant anxiety. It was communication of a sort, but Marcus ached for more. He wanted to hear his son's voice, to know what thoughts moved through that brilliant, isolated mind. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd built a company on communication technology, on connecting the world, but he couldn't connect with his own child. The woman behind the curtain. Victoria Holloway moved through the mansion with the purposeful efficiency of a woman who'd turned motherhood into a military campaign. At 39, she was still striking, tall, lean, with sharp cheekbones and honey blonde hair she wore in a perfect French twist. She'd been a rising star at Pendleton and Worth, one of Seattle's most prestigious corporate law firms, specializing in intellectual property and tech acquisitions. That's how she'd met Marcus 14 years ago, when Vertex Technologies was still small enough to need outside counsel. Their courtship had been brief and practical. She appreciated his mind, he appreciated her competence. Love, in the passionate sense, had never really been part of the equation. They were partners, building something together. When Julian was born, Victoria had taken what she assumed would be a brief maternity leave. Then came the diagnosis, and brief turned into permanent. Victoria had thrown herself into managing Julian's care with the same intensity she'd once brought to $50 million merger negotiations. She read every study, consulted every expert, maintained detailed logs of Julian's behaviors, meals, sleep patterns, and responses to various interventions. The wall of her private office was covered with color-coded calendars, therapy schedules, and progress charts. But somewhere in those 7 years of intensive management, she'd lost herself. The woman who'd once argued cases in front of state Supreme Courts now spent her days negotiating with insurance companies about therapy coverage and researching gluten-free, casein-free recipes that Julian might actually eat. She and Marcus barely spoke anymore beyond logistics about their son. They slept in separate wings of the house, lived separate lives under the same roof, united only by their shared worry and their shared failure to reach the boy they both loved. Victoria told herself this was temporary, that once Julian had a breakthrough, once they found the right intervention, she could return to herself. But 7 years is a long time to wait, and sometimes, late at night, she wondered if she was waiting for something that would never come. The invisible woman. Elena Vasquez had been cleaning the Holloway estate every Tuesday and Friday morning for the past 18 months, and in all that time, she estimated that Marcus Holloway had spoken directly to her exactly 4 times. Twice to give instructions about special cleaning requirements for Julian's sensory room, once to ask her to be quieter because the boy was sleeping, and once to tell her she'd done an excellent job and to expect a holiday bonus. Victoria was more communicative but not by much. She left detailed notes about what needed attention each visit, along with checks for payment and small envelopes on the kitchen counter. Sometimes she'd nod in greeting if their paths crossed. That was the extent of their relationship. Elena was used to it. Invisibility was part of the job description when you clean houses in neighborhoods where individual homes cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. The wealthy didn't see their housekeepers, not really. They saw clean surfaces, fresh flowers, and the absence of dust, evidence of work without acknowledgement of the worker. She was fine with that. Invisible meant stable, and stable was what Elena desperately needed. At 38, Elena had the kind of beauty that life's hardships had weathered but not erased. Her black hair, now threaded with silver she didn't bother to dye, was usually pulled back in a practical bun. Her dark brown eyes, inherited from her Guatemalan mother, held both warmth and a deep exhaustion. Her hands, strong and calloused from years of physical work, told the story of a woman who'd spent her adult life in service to others. She lived in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment in Rainier Valley, one of Seattle's more affordable neighborhoods, with her 18-year-old daughter Sophia. The apartment's thin walls meant she could hear her neighbors' conversations, the plumbing groaned, and the heating was inconsistent at best. But it was clean, it was safe, and she'd managed to keep it for 7 years through sheer stubborn determination and a willingness to work harder than anyone else. Elena had come to Seattle 20 years ago from Los Angeles, following her then-boyfriend David Vasquez, who'd gotten a job opportunity as a computer technician. They'd married young, she was 20, he was 23, full of dreams about the future. David had been brilliant with computers, completely self-taught, with a natural intuition for how systems worked. He'd talked constantly about starting his own business, about building something revolutionary. "I'm going to change the world, Elena," he'd tell her, his dark eyes bright with possibility. "Just wait. We're going to give Sophia everything we never had." Sophia had been born when Elena was 21, a beautiful, bright-eyed baby who'd grown into an even more brilliant young woman. She was currently a freshman at the University of Washington on a partial scholarship, studying pre-med with dreams of becoming a pediatric surgeon. Elena was so proud of her daughter it physically hurt sometimes, a sweet ache in her chest whenever she thought about how far Sophia had come. But David never got to see his daughter graduate high school. He died 7 years ago, just a few weeks after Sophia's 11th birthday, in a car accident on I-5 during a freak rainstorm. Hydroplaned into a barrier, dead on impact. Sudden, meaningless, devastatingly complete. The settlement from the accident had barely covered the funeral costs and 2 months' rent. David's small computer repair business had folded immediately. It had been him and a single employee, and without David's expertise, there was nothing left. Elena had discovered he'd let their life insurance lapse 6 months earlier to cover a business expense. There was no savings to speak of. There was just debt, grief, and an 11-year-old daughter who'd lost her father. So Elena had done what she'd always done: she'd survived. She'd taken whatever work she could find, eventually settling into house cleaning because it paid reasonably well and had flexible hours that allowed her to be present for Sophia. She'd worked for a cleaning service for 5 years before going independent 18 months ago, building her own small client list of wealthy Seattle-ites who paid cash and didn't ask questions. The Holloway estate was her best client. They paid more than double her usual rate and were generally undemanding. She'd been recommended to them by their previous housekeeper, who'd retired, and Victoria Holloway had hired her after a brief, professional interview where Elena's references had spoken for themselves. Elena took pride in her work. She might be invisible, but she was excellent at what she did. Every surface she cleaned was immaculate. Every arrangement she touched looked artfully casual. She knew how to move through wealthy spaces without leaving a trace of herself behind. Except with Julian. The unexpected connection. From her very first day at the Holloway estate, Elena had noticed the boy. How could she not? He was usually sitting alone in some corner, arranging things in patterns, humming tunelessly, lost in his own world while therapists and nannies tried and failed to engage him. Victoria had warned her about Julian during that first day. Our son has special needs. He's nonverbal and can be startled by loud noises or sudden movements. Please be as quiet as possible when he's nearby, and don't try to interact with him. His therapists handle all his engagement. Elena had nodded and agreed, but something about the boy pulled at her heart. Maybe it was because he reminded her of Sophia at that age, the same dark curls, the same delicate beauty. Maybe it was because she recognized the loneliness in him, the sense of existing behind glass, separate from everyone else. Maybe it was just a mother's instinct to nurture anything young and vulnerable. Whatever the reason, she found herself aware of him in a way she tried not to be. She'd notice what he was doing, what seemed to calm him, what made him anxious. She observed without interfering, respected without ignoring. And then, about 3 months into her employment, something shifted. She'd been cleaning the great room, humming quietly to herself as she often did when she worked, an old Spanish lullaby her mother had sung to her. She thought Julian was upstairs with his morning speech therapist, but when she turned around with her dust cloth, he was sitting on the floor about 6 feet away, staring at her. She'd frozen, not wanting to startle him. They'd looked at each other for a long moment, and then he'd gone back to arranging his blocks as if she wasn't there. But the next week, the same thing happened. And the week after that. Within 2 months, it became a routine. When Elena arrived on Tuesday and Friday mornings, Julian would eventually find his way to whatever room she was cleaning and sit nearby. Not close, he never came within touching distance, but near enough to be in her presence. He seemed to like her humming, so she kept doing it, mixing Spanish folk songs with English ones, her voice soft and undemanding. She never tried to talk to him or engage him directly. She just let him exist in her orbit, the same way she existed in his. It felt respectful somehow, like two solitary creatures sharing space without intrusion. She'd never mentioned this to Victoria or Marcus. It felt like it might somehow violate the boundaries she'd been given, Don't interact with him, even though she wasn't technically interacting. She was just being. And he was just being. Together. Sometimes she'd leave small things near where he sat, nothing significant, just objects she thought might interest him. A smooth river stone from her daughter's rock collection. A colorful ribbon from a package. A pine cone from the estate's grounds. She never saw him pick these items up, but they always disappeared by her next visit. Elena told herself she was being foolish, projecting maternal feelings onto a child who wasn't hers and probably didn't even register her as a distinct person. But she couldn't help herself. In some strange way, those quiet moments near Julian, humming old songs while he arranged his blocks, were the most peaceful parts of her week. She had no idea that she was the only person in the world whose presence Julian actively sought out. His therapists considered him avoidant. His parents experienced him as distant. But with Elena, he felt something he couldn't name or express, something like safety, something like recognition. And on one rainy Friday morning in late October, that silent connection would shatter everything. The day everything changed. The rain came down in sheets that Friday, the kind of relentless Pacific Northwest downpour that turned the world gray and made the inside of the Holloway mansion feel even more like a sealed fortress. Elena had arrived at 6 a.m. as usual, entering through the service entrance with her supplies. The house was quiet except for the steady drum of rain against windows. She'd started in the east wing, working her way methodically through the guest rooms that no one ever used but that still needed weekly dusting. By 9 a.m., she'd made her way to the great room, the heart of the house with its soaring ceiling, massive windows overlooking the grounds, and Victoria's carefully curated collection of modern art. Marcus was in his home office conducting a video conference. She could hear his voice carrying down the hallway, crisp and authoritative. Victoria was in the kitchen on the phone with one of Julian's therapists, discussing some new behavioral protocol. Julian's morning occupational therapy session had been cancelled because the therapist had called in sick, so the boy was in the great room, sitting in his usual spot near the window, arranging his wooden blocks. Elena had smiled when she saw him, that small, private smile she couldn't help. "Buenos dias, mi pequeño amigo," she'd whispered, too quiet for him to hear, too quiet to violate the rule about not engaging him. She'd begun dusting the sculptures on the far wall, humming softly, De Colores, an old folk song her mother had loved. The rain's rhythm against the windows seemed to harmonize with her voice, creating a peaceful, almost meditative atmosphere. She'd been reaching up to dust a particularly tall sculpture when her elbow caught the edge of a side table, knocking over a small decorative bowl. It hadn't broken, expensive things in wealthy homes rarely did, they were too well made, but it had rolled under the table, and several of Julian's blocks had somehow gotten mixed with it, skittering across the polished hardwood floor. "I know," Elena murmured, setting down her duster and kneeling to retrieve the items. "Pardon, sorry." She'd gathered the bowl and was reaching for the blocks when she felt it, a small hand, warm and surprisingly strong, wrapping around her wrist. She froze. Julian had never touched her before. Never. He avoided physical contact with everyone, even his parents. His therapists had to follow strict protocols about any kind of touch, and even then, he usually pulled away. But now he was holding her wrist, not in distress, but with purpose. His grip was firm, almost urgent. Elena slowly raised her eyes to meet his face, barely breathing, terrified of breaking whatever spell had been cast. Julian was staring directly at her, and for the first time in the 18 months she'd known him, he was making deliberate, sustained eye contact. His dark brown eyes, usually so distant, were intensely focused. He looked like he was trying to communicate something crucial, something that transcended his usual silent world. And then he opened his mouth and spoke. "David." The word was crystal clear, perfectly pronounced, unmistakable. His first word. Ever. Elena's entire world tilted on its axis. Her heart seemed to stop and then slam against her ribs like it was trying to escape her chest. The blood drained from her face, leaving her dizzy, nauseous. David. Her husband's name. Her dead husband's name. But that was impossible. There was no way Julian could know that name. She'd never mentioned David at work, never brought personal photos, never discussed her private life. The Holloways knew nothing about her beyond her work references and her address. How could this child, who'd never spoken before, who barely acknowledged her existence, say her husband's name? David, Julian said again, louder this time, more insistent. His grip on her wrist tightened. David. 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 The word escalated into a shout, carrying through the cavernous room and down the hallways of the mansion. In his office, Marcus Holloway's head snapped up from his video conference screen like he'd been electrocuted. The Japanese investors on his monitor were discussing third-quarter projections, but their voices became meaningless noise. That name. He hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in 15 years. 15 years of careful forgetting, of deliberate erasure, of convinced himself it was all in the past, dealt with, finished. His face went from its usual composed mask to ash gray in seconds. His hands, which never trembled even during billion-dollar negotiations, began to shake violently. The pen he'd been holding slipped from his fingers and clattered against his desktop. Mr. Holloway? Marcus? Are you still there? The investor's voice came from his computer speakers, concerned and confused. Marcus couldn't speak. His throat had closed. His vision tunneled. The walls of his office seemed to be closing in. David. Julian's voice came again from down the hallway, and this time there was no mistaking it. Marcus stood so abruptly his chair rolled backward and crashed into the bookshelf behind him. He ended the video conference without a word, without explanation, the screen going dark on the bewildered faces of 3 confused executives. In the kitchen, Victoria Holloway had also heard her son's voice. Her phone slipped from her hand and clattered on the granite countertop. "Did you hear that?" she said to the therapist she'd been speaking with, but she was already moving, already running toward the great room. Julian had spoken. Her baby boy who'd been silent for 7 years had finally spoken. She burst into the great room to find Elena kneeling on the floor, tears streaming down her face, staring at Julian in shock. The boy was holding the housekeeper's wrist, his face more animated and present than Victoria had ever seen it. "Elena!" Victoria cried, rushing over. "What happened? What did he say? Did he really speak?" Elena looked up at Victoria, her face a mixture of joy, confusion, and something that looked almost like fear. "He said, 'Mrs. Holloway,'" he said, "David. But I don't understand, that was my husband's name. My late husband. But how could he possibly know that? How could he? What did you say?" The voice came from the doorway, harsh and raw, and both women turned to see Marcus Holloway standing there. He looked like he'd aged 10 years in the last 30 seconds. His face was still gray, his eyes wild, his perfectly styled hair disheveled where he'd run his hands through it. "Marcus." Victoria stood, confused by her husband's appearance. Julian spoke. He said his first word. "This is incredible, this is. What did you say?" Marcus was staring at Elena like she was a ghost, like she was something that shouldn't exist. Elena stood slowly, unnerved by the intensity of his gaze. "I said, Mr. Holloway, I said my late husband's name was David. I don't know how Julian could have known that. I've never mentioned my personal life here. I don't understand what's happening." Marcus took a step backward, his hand reaching for the doorframe as if he needed it to stay upright. His mouth opened but no sound came out. Behind him, down the hallway, his forgotten computer was still logged into the video conference, the Japanese executives now talking amongst themselves in confused Japanese. "Vasquez," Marcus finally managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. "Your last name is Vasquez?" "Yes, sir," Elena said, increasingly alarmed by his behavior. "Elena Vasquez." Something in Marcus's expression broke completely. If he'd looked gray before, he now looked like death itself. His entire body began to tremble. "Get out," he said. Everyone stared at him in shock. "Marcus, What are you? Victoria began. Get out. The roar was so sudden, so violent, that Julian released Elena's wrist and clapped his hands over his ears, beginning to rock in distress. Elena, you need to leave this house. Now. Right now. Elena stood frozen, terrified, and confused. Mr. Holloway, I don't understand. Did I do something wrong? I didn't mean to. Leave. Marcus's voice cracked. Victoria, pay her for the month and send her home. We'll call if we, just get her out. Victoria had never seen her husband like this. In 14 years together, through every crisis with Julian, through every business disaster, Marcus had never lost control. He was the algorithm. He didn't break. But he was breaking now, right in front of them. Marcus, you're scaring me, Victoria said, moving toward him. What is going on? Handle it, Victoria. Please. The last word came out as a broken whisper, and then Marcus turned and walked away, his gait stiff and unnatural, like a man who might collapse at any moment. Victoria watched him disappear down the hallway, her mind reeling. Then she turned to Elena, who stood in the middle of the great room looking like she might cry, holding her cleaning supplies like they might protect her from whatever madness had just erupted. Elena, I'm so sorry, Victoria said, and she meant it. I don't know what just happened, but I think it's best if you go home for today. I'll pay you for the full month, and I'll call you. I'll call you soon to explain. I promise. Did I do something wrong? Elena's voice was small, frightened. No. No, I don't think so. I think. Victoria trailed off, because she had no idea what she thought. Just go home. Please. Take care of yourself. Elena gathered her supplies with shaking hands and left through the service entrance, her mind spinning with confusion and fear and the impossible memory of a nonverbal child speaking her dead husband's name. Behind her, in the great room, Julian had stopped rocking and was staring at the doorway through which Elena had disappeared. He opened his mouth and, very softly, said one more word. David. And upstairs, locked in his private bathroom, Marcus Holloway was vomiting into the toilet, 15 years of guilt and terror finally catching up to him, triggered by a single word from his son's mouth. A name he'd tried to bury. A name that refused to stay buried. David Vasquez was back, speaking through the boy who'd never spoken at all, and Marcus knew with absolute certainty that his carefully constructed empire of lies was about to come crashing down. Marcus Holloway didn't sleep that night. He sat in his office with the lights off, staring at the rain-streaked windows, a glass of scotch warming in his hand. The house was silent around him. Victoria had taken Julian to his room hours ago, and he could hear nothing from their wing of the mansion. The silence was oppressive, crushing, filled with ghosts. He'd sent Gerard Chen, his head of security, the request at 3 a.m. By 6 a.m., a comprehensive file sat in his encrypted email inbox. Marcus opened it with trembling fingers, though he already knew what he'd find. Elena Vasquez. Age 38. Born in Los Angeles to Guatemalan immigrants. Married David Vasquez at age 20. One daughter, Sofia Vasquez, age 18, currently enrolled at University of Washington studying pre-med on partial scholarship. Employed as independent house cleaner for 18 months. Before that, worked for Clearview Cleaning Service for 5 years. Financially stable but living paycheck to paycheck. No criminal record. Excellent references. And then, the section that made Marcus's hands shake so badly he nearly dropped his phone. David Vasquez. Deceased 7 years ago in traffic accident on I-5. Age 30 at time of death. Survived by wife Elena and daughter Sofia. Operated small computer repair business called Tech Fix Solutions in Capitol Hill neighborhood. Prior to that, worked as computer technician for various companies. No college degree, self-taught programmer and hardware specialist. Marcus scrolled down to the photographs Gerard had pulled from old business records and social media archives. His vision blurred as David's face filled the screen, older than Marcus remembered, weathered by 7 more years of life that Marcus had stolen from him, but unmistakably the same person. The same dark eyes that had blazed with enthusiasm when he'd explained his revolutionary compression algorithm. The same crooked smile he'd flashed when they'd signed their partnership papers. The same hands that had built the prototype that became the foundation of Vertex Technologies. David Vasquez. His partner. His friend. The man whose genius Marcus had stolen, whose life Marcus had destroyed, whose family Marcus had abandoned to poverty while he built an empire on stolen dreams. And now David's widow was cleaning his house. Now David's name was the first word his son had ever spoken. Marcus closed his eyes and let the memory he'd buried for 15 years wash over him. 15 years ago. They'd met at a community college computer repair workshop. Marcus had been there doing market research for his MBA thesis on technology accessibility. David had been there because he loved teaching, loved sharing his knowledge with anyone who'd listen. David had been brilliant in a way that transcended formal education. He understood systems intuitively, saw patterns others missed, could build solutions from nothing but spare parts and determination. Within weeks of meeting, they'd started talking about partnership. David had the technical genius, Marcus had the business acumen. They'd called it Vertex Solutions, a company that would democratize cloud computing, make enterprise-level technology accessible to small businesses. David had developed a data compression algorithm that was revolutionary, that could reduce storage costs by 60% while actually improving speed. It was genius. It was worth billions. They'd worked out of David's garage, living on ramen and coffee, coding until dawn, dreaming impossible dreams. Marcus remembered David talking about his wife, about wanting to buy her a real house someday, about the daughter he wanted to send to the best schools. "We're going to change the world, Marcus," David had said, his eyes bright with belief. "And we're going to do it the right way. No compromising, no selling out. We build something good, something that helps people. But good doesn't scale. Good doesn't attract the kind of venture capital that turns startups into empires." Marcus had started taking meetings without David, pitching a modified version of the business plan, one that prioritized profit over principles. When Blackwell Ventures had offered them $12 million in series of funding, David had wanted to refuse. The terms gave investors too much control, diluted the founder's vision, turned their dream into just another tech company chasing quarterly returns. They'd fought. Bitterly. Marcus had called David naive. David had called Marcus a sellout. "If we sign this, we lose everything we built this for," David had pleaded. The whole point was to do it differently. The point was to succeed, Marcus had shot back. "Your algorithm means nothing if it dies in a garage. I'm signing with or without you." David had looked at him like Marcus had struck him. "Then you're doing it without me. I'll take my algorithm and find someone who still believes in what we started." The threat had been real. The algorithm belonged to David, he developed it, he owned the patent filing. Without it, Marcus had nothing. Without David, Blackwell Ventures would walk. Marcus had made calls. Desperate, furious calls to the lead investor, a cold-blooded woman named Catherine Winters who'd built her fortune on hostile takeovers and creative legal maneuvering. "Make the problem go away," she'd told him. "I don't care how. Either he signs, or he's out of the picture permanently. We're not losing this investment because of one idealistic engineer's principles." Marcus had told himself he was just going to talk to David, convince him, find common ground. He'd arranged to meet David at a coffee shop off Highway 101, halfway between their apartments. David had never arrived. The police report said David Vasquez had lost control of his vehicle on a rain-slicked curve, crashed through a guardrail, and died on impact. No witnesses. No evidence of foul play. Just a tragic accident on a dangerous road during a storm. The funeral had been small. Marcus had attended, played the grieving partner, held Elena's hand while she sobbed. He'd promised to preserve David's legacy, to make sure his work changed the world. Then he'd gone to Catherine Winters with David's research notes, which he'd retrieved from their shared workspace. she'd arranged for the patent to be transferred posthumously through a labyrinth of legal entities. She'd given Marcus enough capital to start over, to rebrand, to become someone new. Adrian Price had died with David Vasquez. Marcus Holloway had been born from their ashes, built on stolen genius and buried guilt. For 15 years, Marcus had told himself David's death was just an unfortunate accident, a tragedy he'd had no part in. He'd convinced himself that building Vertex Technologies into an empire was honoring David's memory, that the algorithm was changing the world the way David had wanted. But late at night, in moments of terrible clarity, Marcus knew the truth. He'd made that call to Catherine Winters. He'd set events in motion. And whether the crash was truly an accident or something darker, Marcus's greed had killed his partner as surely as if he'd cut the brake lines himself. Elena's investigation. Across the city in her small apartment, Elena couldn't sleep either. She sat at her kitchen table with her laptop open, searching for answers she didn't know how to find. "Mama, it's 3 a.m, Sophia said, padding into the kitchen in her pajamas. "You need to rest." "I can't," Elena said. "Something happened today, Mija. Something impossible." She'd told Sophia about Julian speaking, about Marcus's violent reaction, about being sent home. Now she was doing what she should have done months ago, researching her employer. "Marcus Holloway, founder of Vertex Technologies," she read aloud. "Net worth $8.9 billion. Founded the company 15 years ago after securing venture capital from Blackwell Ventures. Revolutionary data compression algorithm forms the basis of company's cloud infrastructure platform." She clicked through articles, interviews, business profiles. Everything painted the same picture: self-made genius, visionary entrepreneur, tech industry titan who'd built his empire from nothing. But something nagged at her. The timing. 15 years ago. The same year David had died. "Sophia, do you remember your father talking about his work? Before he died?" Sophia, now 18 and studying pre-med, frowned in concentration. "I was only 11, Mama. I remember he was excited about something. He was working with someone, I think. A partner. They were building something together." Elena's heart began to race. "Do you remember the partner's name?" "No, wait." Sophia's eyes widened. "I remember overhearing them fight once, on the phone. Papa was angry. He kept saying, 'You're selling us out, you're betraying everything we built.' And then later, he told me he was going to end the partnership, start over with someone else. And then he died," Elena finished quietly. She turned back to her laptop, fingers flying over the keyboard. Vertex Technologies founding, original team, early investors. She clicked through page after page of results. Most articles focused on Marcus Holloway as sole founder. But finally, buried in a tech blog archive from 15 years ago, she found it, a brief mention of Vertex Solutions, a startup that had dissolved after the death of co-founder David Vasquez. Vertex Solutions was a promising cloud computing startup founded by engineers David Vasquez and Adrian Price, the article read. Following Vasquez's tragic death in an automobile accident, Price reformed the company as Vertex Technologies, securing significant venture capital and bringing Vasquez's revolutionary compression algorithm to market. Adrian Price. Not Marcus Holloway. Elena's hands shook as she typed Adrian Price Marcus Holloway into the search engine. The results were sparse, but there, buried in legal documents she barely understood, was a name change filing. Adrian Michael Price had legally changed his name to Marcus Adrian Holloway 15 years ago, 6 months after David's death. "Oh my God," Elena whispered. Sophia leaned over her mother's shoulder, reading. "Mama, what does this mean?" "It means," Elena said slowly, "that the man I work for was your father's business partner. It means he took your father's invention and built an empire from it. It means he changed his name and became someone else." She looked at her daughter, tears forming in her eyes. "And it means he never told us. Never gave us anything. Let us struggle while he became a billionaire using David's work." The pieces were falling into place with horrifying clarity. The violent reaction to David's name. The panic in Marcus's eyes when he'd learned her last name. His immediate need to get her out of his house. He'd recognized the name Vasquez. He'd known exactly who she was. And Julian, somehow, impossibly, had known too. Had spoken the name of a man he'd never met, couldn't have known about, as if David himself was speaking through the boy. "What are you going to do?" Sophia asked. Elena stared at the screen, at the smiling photo of Marcus Holloway at some tech conference, looking confident and successful and completely unlike the terrified man who'd screamed at her to leave his house. "I'm going to find out the truth," she said. "About your father's death. About what really happened. About what Marcus Holloway is hiding." She reached for her phone. It was early morning now, light beginning to break through the rain clouds. She had a name from her past, someone who might help, a journalist who'd covered tech startups back then, who'd interviewed David once. Frank Miller. She'd find him. She'd find anyone who remembered David and Adrian Price and what had really happened 15 years ago. Marcus Holloway had stolen her husband's life work and built a fortune from it. But Elena was beginning to suspect he'd stolen something much darker than intellectual property. And somehow, through Julian's impossible first word, David was telling her to dig deeper, to uncover the truth that had been buried with him. The journalist. Frank Miller was 63 years old and ran a small investigative blog from his cluttered apartment in Fremont. He'd been a respected tech journalist in the 90s and early 2000s, back when Seattle was becoming the next Silicon Valley. Now he was semi-retired, writing occasional pieces about tech industry corruption and corporate malfeasance for an audience of a few thousand dedicated readers. When his phone rang at 7 a.m. with a call from Elena Vasquez, he didn't recognize the name. But when she said David Vasquez and Adrian Price, his interest sharpened immediately. "Mrs. Vasquez," he said, "I interviewed your husband once, about 15 years ago. He was one of the most brilliant engineers I'd ever met. I was planning to write a feature about him and his partner. Then he died, and the whole story fell apart. I've always wondered about that timing." "Mr. Miller," Elena said, her voice steady despite the exhaustion in it, "I think there's more to my husband's death than anyone knows. And I think Marcus Holloway, who used to be Adrian Price, is hiding something terrible." Frank Miller leaned back in his chair, a familiar thrill running through him. After all these years, the story that got away might finally get told. "Mrs. Vasquez," he said, "I think we should meet."